Hey everybody, it's Tommy Canale and welcome to Before the Lights podcast, the show to find out how those in sports, music, and entertainment made their mark. Let's get this one started. Go get your coffee, your eggnog, or your favorite holiday cocktail, because today I have a bonus episode for you, and Merry Christmas, everyone. And joining me on the show is a drummer, composer, singer-songwriter. He's recorded over 100 albums, played live performances to everything from small clubs to festivals, and is the main man behind Uncle Frank's Place, which is all about the Prime Minister of the Underworld, Frank Costello. Please welcome to the show, Casey McBride. Casey, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing great, Tommy. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for joining me on this bonus show for my Christmas episode. It's going to be fun.
Yeah, I get to be a bonus. All right.
Casey, how long have you been involved in music?
I've been playing music since I was about 7, I guess. I got a drum set around that age. My parents were really good about that, kind of encouraging anything I was interested in. So I was lucky, that I lived out on some acreage and I could make noise and not bother anybody. So I've been doing it, pretty much all my life. I'm 52 now. So
where did that influence for music then come for you? For parents, family, somebody else?
I'm not really sure. My mom wasn't very musical, but she was a big fan of music. She, always, like I said, always encouraged me in this, and she loved to listen to music and had a lot of different kind of records, but she didn't play anything, or she couldn't really sing. My dad is, he's kind of a cowboy, and he's always loved like country music, and he's got a pretty good old, kind of cowboy singer voice, but he doesn't really play any instruments. But my older brother, he's about 5 years older than me. He played guitar and trumpet. And I think I used to steal his records all the time, and listen to them. So probably a lot of that came from my older brother.
As a drummer, I was looking up, you've done some stuff, Harvest Gold, a tribute to Neil Young, Fortunate Son, a tribute to CCR, which is really cool, and Richie Bean and the Midnight Travelers. Talk about when you really started to see the progression for yourself becoming a drummer.
Probably the first real memory, I guess, of really wanting to do it, when I was about 15, I'd hooked up with a group of guys that had a band, and we were pretty young, but it was an actual working band. We played weddings, and we played skating rinks, and we played at Chuck E. Cheese, any place that would have us, because we were underage. But they were paying gigs. And I just kind of remember doing the first gig that we did together was a wedding. And then afterwards, the guy paid us. And I was just like, somebody's going to give me money to play drums? What? So that kind of, at that point, I started to take it a little bit more seriously, because I was like, wow, this is something, I could kind of actually go out and do. And people seem to like it. So around 15, I got pretty serious about it. I was playing every day for, a few hours, and we were out doing gigs, and I just tried to learn everything I could about it at that point. So
is there a particular gig that you had that sticks out in your mind as a drummer that you keep going back to going, that one was cool?
We've had a few like that, usually playing in like small theater size venues and stuff like that, where it's kind of an intimate venue, but there's enough, there's a couple hundred people out there, and the sound is good, and the mood is cool, because you're actually in a theater with, lights and the curtain behind you. It seems real, sort of. A lot of these gigs, you're playing at a pub or at a bar, just you're crammed in the corner someplace, and it's fun, but it's not like putting on a show. But I think probably some of those theater gigs, a lot of those that we've done with like the CCR tribute and stuff like that, people love their CCR, I've found. So you can get some pretty good gigs, doing that. And the people respond to it. It's really, they love that music. So when the people are responding to it, or they're out there dancing, it's a lot of fun. It's not work anymore. It's a good time.
It's a great genre of music. You're also a composer. You've done music on podcasts such as Gangland Wire, which is hosted by Gary Jenkins, who's been a previous guest of mine, and you and I are fortunate enough to be on his private Zoom calls that he does. Great guy. And you've also done stuff for his documentaries, Brothers versus Brothers, the Savella Sparrow War, and also Albert Anastasia, the Mafia's Lord High Executioner. What kind of rewards do you get from being a composer and seeing the work that you've put together is being put out there by somebody else?
I love it. I think it's great. I really like to do that kind of music where it's instrumental music. It's, there's no melody really or vocals or anything like that. And you're trying to set a mood to a specific scene. And when you're doing the soundtrack work like that, you get to do that. You get to really focus on creating kind of an energy for the film. And when it works, it's great, because when you kind of do it in your head and you're trying to picture what it's going to be like, you never know if it's actually going to fit, the way that you want it to. But then when I get to see it back, and, even though it's in the background, you're kind of part of really creating this story or creating this mood that's happening in the atmosphere. And I like it. That's probably my favorite kind of, music to make, and my favorite kind of work to do. It's, you have to do a specific thing. Somebody comes to you with an idea. And I think for some people that can be kind of limiting, because they just want to, have free reign to do whatever they want. But I kind of like having limitations and some parameters that somebody wants, to make something very specific. And so it eliminates a lot of these possibilities. And you really have to kind of pinpoint and focus in on a certain thing. And it's fun.
And it's also something that looking at it, it's all organized crime related, which you're a fan of. So I think that helps correlate for you being able to set the mood and get that kind of music out there.
It does. I've seen a lot of mob movies and those kind of movies and stuff. So it's a specific kind of music, obviously. When you hear some of the stuff I've done for Gary, it as soon as you hear it, it kind of evokes the spirit of the Godfather. It's also that kind of old Italian style music, and which I like too. I think I love that kind of music. So it's neat. You get kind of an intersection of two interests that kind of work together. You don't get to do that very often, where you can combine your hobbies or your interests, and they come together in a good way.
More on the organized crime as a singer-songwriter. There's an EP called Gangsters and Ghosts. Is that out, Casey?
It's not done yet. It was supposed to be, and then, best laid plans with this COVID thing. So I kind of invested some money into making my own personal home studio. And so I'm going to finish the EP here on my own. I got a few more songs I need to get done, but I've been working on it pretty hard here the last couple of weeks. So hopefully by, sometime early 2021, that's going to be out. It should have been out, over a year ago, but nothing I could do about that, I guess, at this point. So I won't complain.
Better late than never. Some of the singles I checked out are, 3 Can Keep a Secret, which is kind of cool in organized crime. But as we always say, 2 of them are dead. Yeah. And Better Than That. And I Like It Like That. And there's another one that I just recently listened to that's got a little Bad Leroy Brown kind of theme to it. And what's the name of that one?
That one's The Cold Heart of the Big Apple. And that's a little tune about the rivalry between Vito Genovese and Frank Costello, and kind of what went down with the changing of the guard in New York. And I thought that I love Jim Croce, and I love the way he tells those, those old story songs. And I thought, since this was kind of, a rock'em sock'em story, it would fit that kind of genre. So I purposely tried to make it like a Jim Croce song, as a tip of the hat to him in a way.
I'll put a link in the show notes to your website, and people can check those out. But Casey, why don't you give out your website as well to our listeners?
It's CaseyMcBrideMusic.com. And you can find pretty much most of the stuff I've done in the past that's worth listening to, and kind of keep up if you want to follow what I'm doing in the future. Hopefully we'll get some more gigs coming our way here.
I hope you do. And at the very end of the show, after the credits and the music, stay tuned. We're going to play one of Casey's Christmas songs that he did with Tara Williamson called Carol of the Bells. And when was that recorded?
That was done back in 2010 with my good buddy George Turner, who's also on that recording. He produced it and recorded it in his studio. And we used to have a little kind of jazz combo between the three of us. And figured, hey, it'd be great to have a Christmas album that we could offer to people, because we did a lot of Christmas gigs at that time. And so we went in the studio and chose some songs and whipped them out in about a day and a half, I think. It was pretty quick, but it turned out good. It was fun to do a Christmas album. That's not something that I would have, figured I'd enjoy, but it was a lot of fun.
Cool. Once again, stay tuned. After the credits, you're going to hear the entire song of Carol of the Bells, all of you out there for our Christmas time this season. Casey, where'd your mob interest in general come from?
That actually, it's weird. It started through music in a roundabout way. I was taking drum lessons from a guy named Don Worth here in Portland, Oregon. And he was an older guy at that time, and he'd come out of like the big band era. And I've always loved that music. And I was an older student at the time. I was in my mid-20s, and I think most of his students were little kids. So he enjoyed having, kind of a semi-adult to talk to at these lessons every once in a while. And he would tell me stories just about the old days. And I loved listening to him. And they were always, clubs with these mob guys that he either owned them or the union that was mobbed up. And I was just fascinated by those. So it kind of piqued my interest in that era, the 40s and 50s, but the clubs, the whole thing. It wasn't just the true crime history part of it. I just, I'm fascinated by that whole time, actually. But I saw The Sopranos after that, and I loved that. I got really into that show.
Yeah.
And then as soon as that was over, I was like, oh man, what am I going to do? And I decided to maybe learn a little bit more about the real history of it. And I went to the bookstore, and I've got The Five Families from Selwyn Rabb. And I just picked it because it was the biggest book, on the shelf. I didn't know at the time, it's kind of considered like the Sergeant Pepper of mob books by a lot of people. It's pretty well regarded. But I read that book, and I was hooked. The thing that I noticed was the reason, you love The Sopranos was the story and the plots. But after reading that book, I realized like so many of those stories were real events. They just changed the names or, changed a couple things about it. And I was like, man, you can't make this stuff up. It's amazing history. So I was a fan of fiction. And after I kind of got into this, I kind of stopped reading fiction books so much because I thought these were just as interesting, but it was real, so you get a little bit of history. You kind of learn something at the same time by accident, which was cool.
Agreed.
So that's kind of how it started with me.
Why Frank Costello, and when did you decide to go, let's start Uncle Frank's Place?
Well, once you start studying that history, if you're going to, put any effort into it, it won't take long until his name's going to pop up. Mm-hmm. He was just such a immense figure in that world. And I was watching A&E made a series of documentaries back, quite a while ago, I think now, but they're all on YouTube, and they basically picked out each of these kind of famous mobsters, and they did a show on them. And I binged on all those on YouTube. I thought they were great. And then when I got to the Frank Costello one, it was really different from the other ones. All the other ones, were blood and guts and this and that, and it was all about that side of it. And when it came to Frank, that's not really what he was about. He was more of a fixer and a political, kind of guy. And, it was the only one that when it ended, after he'd passed on, that it seemed like people they kind of missed him. There were people that had good things to say about the guy, and all the other ones, were completely different. So I was like, wow, this is interesting. He's got kind of a different angle of this whole true crime thing. And he wasn't really known to be like a killer. He was more of like I said, a political fixer. And that stuff really fascinates me. Just, how they move in that world and the deals that are made. So I started just kind of, digging into his history a little bit more. And there's so much of it. First of all, he lived in a time, pre-Prohibition all the way up into the 70s. So he was around for what I consider all the major, pretty much mob events that happened in the United States. Not only was he around, he was part of them. He was an important guy in that world. So there was a lot to find on him. Most of these guys, there's not a whole lot of information of them out there, and that's the way they wanted it. But Frank, for a few reasons, there's a lot of stuff out there on him that you can learn. So at that same time, I just kind of gotten into social media, and I discovered the National Crime Syndicate.com, the NCS, and they were looking for people who wanted to contribute. So they put a kind of a call out, does anybody want to try to write something for the website? And so I put my hat in the ring. I was the first one that kind of did that, and they sort of let me do whatever I want. And I started writing about Frank Costello, and people seemed to be interested in it. So I was like, what if I'm going to try a Facebook page, and maybe, somebody will see it. I'll get maybe 50, 100 people on there and share some stories, might learn something. And as soon as I started it, it was only about 2 or 3 weeks after that, some of the members of his family got on there, started contacting me.
Wow.
And people came out of the woodwork. I had no idea where that was going to lead me. That little Facebook page, people have a lot of negative things to say about the social media thing that's going on right now. But I had nothing but positive experiences from that. And it gave me a lot of opportunities that I would never have ever imagined when I started that thing. So, and, when I did get contacted by some of his family members originally, I thought they were going to be pissed and tell me to take it down, cut this out. But they were as interested in it as I was. So
That's cool.
It's been a really cool experience.
The Facebook page has over 7,000 followers. And if you're even remotely interested in organized crime or anything that Casey has to talk about, Frank Costello, I would highly suggest you go to his page and like it and join it and be part of it. There is fantastic stuff on there. Before we go into exactly what's on there, how much time are you devoting to this page these days?
Not as much as I did originally. It's been up for 5 years now. So I'm kind of getting sort of to the end of mining all that Frank Costello territory. I've gone through a lot of stuff in that 5 years, and eventually you're going to get to the end of it where there's just not going to be as much. So I really don't have to do as much with it as I used to. I have a friend, Mike Mafucci, who helps me run it, and also Noel Castiglia, who's a relative of Frank's, helps me with it as well. So that they contribute things, here and there. And a lot of it these days comes from just kind of scouring other pages on true crime stuff, because a lot of other people will find things and you're like, oh, I've never seen that. You share it to the page and it's easy. And then now that information's all kind of in one place. The one thing I wish Facebook was better about, I wish you could organize the info better, because, there's not really a good way of putting things in, specific areas on, certain topics. It's kind of just, you have to scroll down and just go, picture by picture or story by story. But it's, like I said, I would never imagine I would still be doing this 5 years later. And, when every once in a while I'll go on there and I'll look and I'm just like, man, there's if you want to know something about Frank Costello, I don't want to boast too much, but there's not really anything else like that out there. There's books, there's a lot of books and things on them, but they don't have all the pictures. They don't have the videos, the, audio and that kind of stuff. And that's all on there. So, if you're interested in the guy, that's it. That's where you want to go.
Casey, talk about the neighborhood gang that he was in called the 104th Street Gang.
Well, he got started in that. He was born in Laropoli in 1891, but he came over here to the United States, we think sometimes probably around 1895 or so. So he was a young kid at that point, and he ended up in East Harlem, which is a story that's real familiar to all of these main kind of mob guys that we hear about. They sort of came in this big wave in that late sort of part of the century and, early part of the next one. And he was having trouble in school. He didn't speak the language very well. And it was tough for him. I can imagine that would have been, a pretty traumatizing experience for any child. And his older brother, Ed, had been in the United States already for a few years. He came over ahead of him. And so, he's his older brother. Frank looks up to him, and his brother at that point had already been kind of running around out in the streets, getting into trouble. So when Frank got over here, he followed his brother's lead, and he ended up getting into what they call the 104th Street Gang there in East Harlem. And, he was running like crap games, dice games, things like that. He started doing errands for some of the bigger mob guys. They took notice of him pretty quick. He was a smart kid. He was good with numbers, and he was good at doing what he said he would do, so they knew he could be trusted, and they started taking him under his wing. And there were guys around that time like Lupo the Wolf and Terra Nova, the Artichoke King, and stuff. And so Frank came up under guys like that. That would eventually turn into the Genovese family. But at that time, it was still kind of run by what they called the Mustache Pete's and that stuff. But so he started getting in trouble pretty early with that gang. When he was a teenager, he stayed with that up until his mid-teens. And at some point, he got a job on a steamer, and he went back and forth to South America working on this boat for a couple of years. And so he stayed out of trouble for a few years there. But as soon as he got back, he went right back into it. And right around that time was when Prohibition hit. And so he was able to, go from doing sort of these little penny ante crimes with these gangs and things like that. And when Prohibition came, he was ready to go. And he got underneath Arnold Rothstein's tutelage. And from there, he became a millionaire pretty quick after, like a lot of those guys. Prohibition made, like these petty criminals into, millionaires. Instantly. It's amazing.
He got to be known as the prime minister of the underworld. What transpired, for let my listeners know, and why he was known as that?
There's a couple stories about, how that came about. The most famous one, now, whether or not this is true or not, I'll just interject right there too. A lot of the stuff on Frank's place, it's not necessarily something that I believe is true. If I find something out there that is about Frank Costello, it could be an editorial cartoon, could be some movie, that his character was in, I'll post it on there and then let people kind of make up their own mind about it. But the one of the stories that you'll hear a lot is that when they had the Atlantic City conference and Al Capone was there, and the St. Valentine's Massacre had just happened, and a lot of these head, mob guys wanted him to cool it a little bit. He was bringing too much attention to everything. So at this conference, one of the things that they wanted to talk was to get Capone to turn himself in on some kind of a charge, maybe to quell the public and cool things down a little bit. And apparently Frank was one of the guys who talked him into it. And he also helped arrange a lot of the Atlantic City conference. And from there, people kind of noticed, this guy's really good at moderating and being a mediator and getting people together and making things happen. So, they started calling him the prime minister just because he was good at that kind of stuff. And that was where he excelled. He would later on sort of become the mob's kind of liaison to the upper world, when they had to have contacts with politicians and people that weren't criminals. Not all of those guys are good at that. Some of those guys were really scary. People in the public don't want to deal with them. And, you can understand why. But Frank, he wasn't really like that. He was good at talking to people. He was a charming guy and could maneuver in that world easily, where some of those guys weren't that good at that kind of thing. So that kind of became his job in the underworld. And his nickname, they called him the Prime Minister, which is a pretty cool nickname, actually.
It is. Casey, tell us something about Frank Costello that we may not know or the average listener doesn't know about him.
Oh, there's a few things probably. I think one of the interesting ones was he was one of the guys behind starting the National Enquirer. His godson, Generoso Pope Jr., started that paper. And when he did, he didn't really have the funds to keep the payroll going from month to month. So every month he would borrow money from Frank Costello and, put out an edition. And when it made enough money that he could pay Frank back, he would pay him back. And that went on for probably 6 months or so until he got, enough collateral to keep it going himself. But Frank was one of the guys responsible for getting the National Enquirer started.
That's super cool. He was the leader of Luciano crime family. And in 1957, there was a hit on him, attempted hit. Why was that hit put out?
Ooh, there's a lot of theories about that. the most common one was just that Vito Genovese wanted to take over the family, and he needed to get, at that point, depending on who you talk to, a lot of people say, Frank was the boss, and so he was standing in the way. And, some of those guys, the easy solution is just get rid of the guy. But I think it's a little more complicated than that. I don't necessarily think that Frank I don't think he considered himself to be the boss. I think he considered himself to be a caretaker for Lucky, who had been deported at that time. And he was sort of running things on his behalf. And Vito Genovese he had to leave the country pretty early on in that whole history to avoid a murder rap. But he ended up coming back to New York. And when he did, a lot of people, I think the common, story out there is, well, Frank was running things at that time because he was sort of the next in line. And then, and Vito wanted the job back. But I think in a lot of ways, Vito did get the job back when he came back. I think Frank, still considered him probably to be the head guy. The problem was that Frank, a lot of his rackets were really where the money was coming in from. Frank was really successful, first of all, in the Prohibition, like I said, and then when Prohibition ended, he went into slot machines and gambling, and he was a real pioneer in kind of the gaming industry here in the country at that time. So his businesses were bringing in a lot of money. And I don't, Vito, even if he was in charge, it really wasn't his rackets that were bringing in the cash. And whoever's bringing in the cash is the guy that people are going to go to, for, whatever. I think Vito he needed to get rid of Frank so he could feel like he really did have full control over everything. So he put a hit out on him, the Chin Gigante, which you did a really good show on with Larry McShane that I enjoyed. Supposedly followed Frank into his lobby at his apartment, said, "This is for you, Frank." And Frank turned around and he fired a shot. And luckily, because Frank was moving, the shot just grazed his head. It put a hole in his hat, but it didn't kill him. And the Chin thought he was dead and left, took off in a car, but Frank survived. And I mean, he got the message, so he retired. So the end result was the same, but there's a lot of controversy too, and stories around that where some people say he never meant to kill him. It was just supposed to be a warning. There's even some conspiracy theories out there that he wasn't the shooter. I don't subscribe to either of those. I mean, I just think that's too complicated, and I don't know anybody out there that could really make a shot where you could just graze somebody's head like that, Yeah. And Occam's razor, the simplest solution is usually the one, and I think he simply missed. But
especially with the line, "This is for you, Frank."
Yeah, exactly. So Frank, he was real lucky, and he was supposedly retired at that point, but he never really did. He was always still sought after for advice to help with problems. He was still a really important figure all the way up until the time he died in 1973. An old man. He was, in his early 80s at the time. And some of the folks I've talked to that had actually met him and knew him and were in that world. One of the guys, he remembered meeting him just a few months before he passed away, and they were meeting him on they needed some help with a union problem that they had. So, I mean, people were still coming to him with issues and problems to solve all the way up until, the time that he died. And according to this guy that I talked to, they said, there was no moss growing under his shoes. He was sharp as a tack still. And I think he enjoyed people coming to him to solve problems like that. He got another nickname, Uncle Frank, which he really liked. Everybody, he's like the uncle that solved all your problems, kind of a thing. So he was an important guy, like I said, pretty much from the get-go.
Did his downfall begin, do you feel like, with the Senate hearing where he really had no Fifth Amendment protection?
It didn't help, for sure. The big problem with that was, that was one of the first televised media events like that, and it was huge. Everybody was watching it. There was nothing else to watch, and so his name, his face, all of that, he was known all over the country at that point. And it's pretty hard to be a crime boss when everybody recognizes you, walking down the street, that, people are asking for autographs and things like that. So I think that was sort of the beginning of the end for him there. I don't necessarily think people wanted him out of the picture necessarily, but because he was valuable and he was a big, help. He was a great member of your team. You want a guy like that, but it got to a point where he's getting followed, everywhere he went by FBI. They were bugging his apartment, bugging the restaurants he was at. So, like I said, it's really hard to be an effective crime boss when you're under the microscope all the time. So yeah, I think that was one of the things that started to bring the downfall for him. A lot of people, I think, tend to think that, these guys were completely under the radar until some of these events, but that's not necessarily true. The cops knew who they were. A lot of those cops were on Frank's payroll. He was good at that kind of stuff. So it's not that he wasn't known, but once the public really, became aware of who he was, it started to get really difficult for him. And the 50s, that happened. It was 50, 51. Right after that, he spent the 50s, constantly in legal trouble, this and that. Nothing ever serious. It was usually taxes or, deportation, things like that. But they were on him constantly. So by the time that in 1957, when they did, they had the failed hit attempt on him and they wanted him to retire, I think he was more than happy to retire.
He was done. He was done with it.
And he was, he was doing really well on his own. He had a lot of rackets, a lot of legitimate businesses and stuff. Yeah. So when he retired, and it's not like he became destitute and was living on the street. He still had a Manhattan penthouse, a really nice house out in the country. He was living the life. So, like I said, I think he, in a lot of ways, he was like, great, these problems are yours now. I'm going to go enjoy my salad years, as a rich old man hanging out at the track and playing golf all day. So kind of a win-win situation for him in a way.
He inspired Don Corleone from The Godfather to the point where Marlon Brando actually watched old footage of Frank Costello to play the part. And I'm not sure how many people out there that are my listeners understand that, The Godfather was based not solely, but a lot on Frank Costello.
Yeah, it was based on a couple of the Godfathers, but a lot of it was based on Frank. When he did that Kefauver, all that was televised on the advice of his lawyer. He didn't want his face on TV, so they focused on just his hands, and it was called the hand ballet. It became very famous. But Frank had an operation, a botched operation around 1933, where one of his larynxes was paralyzed. So he had like a husky voice where it was almost like a whisper. And, he couldn't talk very loud or for very long before his voice would give out. So when people saw his hands and then they heard that voice, it immediately conjures all these images in your head of this, this back alley, big old mobster guy. And had they shown his face, I think he would have fared better because he was good on camera, and he actually looked like an amiable guy. He wasn't a scary looking dude. He was a pretty charming guy. But Brando watched that like everybody else and heard that voice, and that was where he got the inspiration to have that voice for Vito. But a lot of the things, also in there, just like, the Coming to America story, that's not just Frank's story. That's a lot of those guys' stories.
Yeah, for sure.
Was inspired by him. Also that Frank Sinatra and the those connections and the horsehead thing. Frank was involved with that in real life, helping Frank Sinatra get the role in From Here to Eternity, but he did it with a phone call. He had, guys in those talent agencies that owed him favors, and all those guys were usually happy to do Frank Costello a favor. That was good to have in your pocket. So there was no horsehead or any violence involved in that, but that doesn't make for a good cinema. You got to have something a little bit more dramatic. So a lot of that's been changed. But there's a, from like I said, from the Facebook page, one of the things that happened is I got to be on the Reels Network Shocking Truth episode on, just the similar stories between Frank Costello and Don Corleone. And, all from that Facebook page. They flew me down to San Francisco and I got to be on the TV, and Selwyn Rabb was in that episode as well. So, I went from, getting his book kind of got me started to being able to be on a little documentary with him. And that was a big thrill for me.
That's cool. Frank had a quote, "One of us had to die. With me, it tends to be the other guy."
Yeah. Well, here's the thing about the Costello. One of the things is he doesn't end up in a lot of movies as his real character. Like if you watch Boardwalk Empire or those, he doesn't show up in that show, which is a show of East Coast bootleggers, and it didn't have Frank Costello in it, and he wasn't really in the Ken Burns Prohibition documentary either, which I was like, I don't understand how you can tell that story without having him in there. But one movie that used his name was The Departed. Jack Nicholson's character was called Frank Costello, even though that character is more based on probably Whitey Bulger. It has nothing to do with the real Frank Costello. But there's a lot of quotes out there that are attributed to Frank Costello that are actually from that movie. And I think that's actually one of them. I don't think Frank ever said that. I think that just came from the Departed movie. And now everybody thinks Frank Costello, the real Frank Costello, said it. So
there you go. You heard it. It's not really come from Frank.
I don't think that one is. He did have a couple of cool quotes. The most famous one was, I paid my taxes.
Right.
See the footage of him with that and stuff like that. But he was good in the press, talking with reporters and stuff like that. He usually had something kind of witty or funny to say. So, there were some pretty good quotes from him out there. But I think that one's actually just the Jack Nicholson one.
Last question, Casey. He's buried in St. Michael's Cemetery in Queens, New York. Have you been to the grave?
Oh, yeah, I have. One interesting thing about that, even after he died, he still was making headlines a couple of years later when Carmine Galante got out of jail. He had Frank Costello's mausoleum bombed and the doors were blown off of the mausoleum. You can see the pictures of it. It was quite a story at the time. But when you go there to see his mausoleum, you can still see the damage on the doors where they were blown off. It's been repaired and they've been put back up there, but you can see where that happened. I thought that was kind of interesting.
Casey, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Pleasure.
Talking about your life as a musician and enlightening everybody and myself on Frank Costello. I appreciate it.
Hey, it's my pleasure. I'm always happy to talk about Frank Costello.
For show notes, go to our website, beforethelightspod.com, click on the episode pages, and follow us on Instagram at Before the Lights Podcast. If you want to get more information, be part of a Zoom call, and much more, including extra 5 episodes, join the Patreon group. Go to patreon.com/Before the Lights. Thank you for listening to Before the Lights. I'm Tommy Canale. And until next time, everybody, a salute, a chin chin.
Seem to say throw cares away. Christmas is here, bringing good cheer to young and old, meek and the bold. Ding 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 dong, ding 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 dong. Seems to hear words of good cheer.